want to welcome you to this first webinar in a series on how to deal with compliance with upcoming regulation. In this case, it is NIS2. I believe many of you on this webinar will know NViso. For those of you who don't, let me quickly mention that we are a specialist cybersecurity firm, privately held, an independent international specialist with offices in 4 countries, but we operate in more than a dozen countries, serving more than 100 clients, going from very large multinationals to innovative startups, and we are about 300 professionals. That's NViso. And given the upcoming regulation of NIS2, we have decided to start a series of webinars. And today you attend the first one of these webinars, which will talk about governance, risk and compliance in the context of this upcoming regulation. But there are 2 more already scheduled. One will deal with incident management and business continuity, another one with software security, and as the need arises, we may come with more webinars on this topic. So stay tuned, follow us on LinkedIn so that you are aware of what we are bringing to you and that we can help you in complying with NIS2. Let me go immediately to our agenda. We want to start with a bit of a background, why this regulation is broader and deeper than what we have seen before, why governance, risk and compliance is really the cornerstone to full adherence to this regulation, and then a really practical journey on how you can comply, because we understand that everybody on this webinar is on a journey. Some of you may be in very large organizations and well advanced. Some of you may be in smaller organizations and maybe still figuring out what exactly to do. So the practical steps to take will conclude this webinar. There have been many webinars on the subject of NIS2. It is heavily debated, but we want to give you here perhaps a little bit an insight in what is behind it and what will it mean. And so this is the reason why we have a short introduction. Network and information security, this is what NIS stands for, is basically an effort by the European community to drive the level of cyber defense individually and collectively. And the regulation also talks about how the authorities in each country that address cybersecurity going to collaborate, how they are going to exchange information and basically create the foundation for what could be the beginning of a collective defense. And it also talks about what individual companies are expected to do. Now, we are already at the second iteration of this regulation. The first iteration was basically focused at critical infrastructure, things like major airports, gas pipelines, nuclear power plants, and so on, about 7 sectors representing 20,000 companies in the European Union. And it was basically focusing on network and application security. There is also a US equivalent to this initiative, where the United States President has issued executive orders by sector to do similar things. Now, NIS2 is coming into, let's say, adherence later this year at the national level. At the European level, it has already been approved, and NIS2 broadens the scope of this one significantly. First of all, it now covers 17 sectors instead of 7, and it also covers what is called essential and important companies. Think of small and mid-sized enterprises, which are more than 300,000 companies in the European Union. But it also expands the control scope in terms of it covers the supply chain of your software, and your hardware. It focuses on business continuity and incident management and reporting. Those are new areas. So this is an overview of who is involved. It used to be focused on so-called strategic sectors like energy or health or financial markets, but now space, government services, research, chemicals are also added. And also important companies with a 5 million euro turnover or 20 employees or essential companies are in scope of the regulation. Now, how they will be, quote unquote, controlled by public authorities is a little bit different, but we will come back to that later on. I think it's important for you to realize that even if you are not part of these sectors, you may be impacted because critical sectors or other sectors will be asked to better understand how their suppliers are cyber secure or not. And therefore, even if you are not directly in scope, you may get questions from your clients or from important suppliers on your cybersecurity posture. The timeline, we are already way into implementation. The European regulation came into effect early January of last year, and member states are converting this European regulation in national regulation by April 2025, and it is planned that the directive will be revised, and as usual, you can perhaps even expect in the future a NIS2 by 2027. Important is for you to understand that you, in principle, should be compliant by the 17th of October. And what compliance means is exactly what we're going to discuss in this type of webinar. What is new compared to the NIS1 regulation is the focus on incident management and reporting. Create a better understanding of what's going on. The reporting needs to happen to your local cybersecurity authority. Business continuity and crisis management are also important, and supply chain security came into the focus as well. Now, why did that happen? Well, first of all, the regulator became aware of the fact that vulnerabilities embedded in hardware or software became much more important and were affecting many more organizations. There are a couple of examples like SolarWinds, which affected approximately 28,000 clients of that software company, or Log4j, which is a Java library, which affected probably most of you who do Java development, or Spectre, which was a deficiency in Intel processors. So your supply chain becomes a source of risk, and the regulator realizes that and will force you to reflect on that in terms of your cybersecurity defenses. In addition to that, COVID-19 changed the way many of us are working, extending corporate networks, introducing new risks, and that was a second driver, of course, to enhance the controls for business continuity. One example being the recommended use of multi-factor authentication for accessing your computer infrastructure. And then finally, the realization that not every cyber incident is publicly known, and that therefore the quote-unquote size of the problem might be bigger than public information will give us. And that leads to the notification requirements that you will have. The regulation introduces the normal amount of fines, and of course, any cyber incident gives you reputational damage and a cost. But it's important to realize that it also exposes the leaders of companies to possible criminal charges, or in extreme cases, immediate suspension of the role. This is quite new. Now, how will this be enforced? there will be inspections of two types. First of all, if you are a critical infrastructure, you will potentially receive an inspection. If you are an essential or important company, you might expect an inspection by your local cyber authority after an incident. Now, governance, risk, and control is really key to adhere to the NIS2 regulation. And this may be a little bit of a conceptual picture, but what is really happening is the risk is out there. It is represented by the inherent risk level, and that is actually going up. You see the arrow. Cyber risk increases over time as threat actors become more sophisticated and leverage new techniques. What we all do is we implement a set of controls next to potentially buying insurance to basically reduce that risk level. That's why we have antivirus. That's why we use complex passwords. And you can go very far in that level of control. But basically what the regulation does is it says, here is a minimum level of control I expect so that your residual risk, which is the risk that remains after the application of your controls to the inherent risk, is lower than what I believe as a regulator is an acceptable level. Now, this is very dynamic. If the outside risk increases, you will have to increase your controls. And it may be that the regulator will tighten, or perhaps, I don't think so, but it could also theoretically happen, loosen the compliance-driven risk level. But that is what we are trying to do with GRC. We take a big amount of risk, we apply controls, and therefore the residual risk should be less. And there are a couple of things that guide you. You have a couple of global frameworks that take a holistic approach, and they describe control frameworks. Everybody is most likely familiar with the ISO 27000 family. There is the NIST, there is the CIS, and there is OWASP, and they focus all on providing you a framework for controls. What will happen with NIS2 is that national cyber authorities will develop national guidelines which reflect these global frameworks, but they may add a personal national twist. In Belgium, we have the CCB. In Germany, we have CRITIS. In Greece, we have other mechanisms like the Digital Security Guide. Every country will have its own. And the country frameworks will blend multiple industry frameworks. Now, in general, if you want to implement a control framework, it will start with policy articulation. Policy articulation will basically handle things like what you want with confidentiality of your documentation. You may decide to encrypt everything at rest or in motion, or you may not. Taking that decision is a policy. These policies are relatively stable. They don't change that much. The standards, which are the tools to implement the policies, could change. For example, you may decide to have a more advanced encryption technology. And then the procedures basically tell you how to implement all that. And then finally, that leads to reporting. Now, as you become more mature, you will probably expand your policy framework, use more sophisticated tools, but it's important to realize that it's quite rare that somebody is completely effective, even for the largest companies. And the deep implication is that if you want to demonstrate compliance with NIS2, probably documentation of what you have already done in this field is really essential in case you get an audit. Now, there are different maturity levels. Many of us are at different stages of this journey. The first stage is that you use static controls, basically to try and control threats. You might, in a more advanced stage, correlate your static controls over time. and start to link different events to fight more sophisticated threats. And of course, there's an optimum where you dynamically adapt your policy given what is happening there. Many national authorities offer tooling in terms of guidelines, playbooks that reflect these different types of maturity. And a good example of that is the Belgian Cyber Fundamentals, which basically come almost like a t-shirt in different sizes. The good news is that if you are a small company, and this is relatively new to you, you can probably get to a relatively high level of protection by following the playbook as it is given, for example, in the small version of the Belgium Cyber Fundamentals. Now, your journey to compliance is dependent on your maturity, but you also need to be quite practical. And here is where I'd like to hand over to my colleague Vincent Defrenne to guide you to the next level of practical implementation of compliance for NIS2. Vincent, the floor is yours.
Vincent, I think you're muted.
Okay, in terms of risk control, this is the reason why we have two presenters. So what I will do is I will take over here and start introducing the journey. You have seen this framework already. I believe Vincent may have experienced some connection problems, and I will guide you through the practical implementation. When Vincent comes back online, I'm sure he will chip in.
I am back online because, of course, it had to crash the moment I had to speak, right? Otherwise, it's no fun.
All right, so I was a bit of a bridging with some general introduction, Vincent. We had our block of commercials, but it's over to you to now define the framework of really practically implementing the NIS2 compliance.
All right, so second part of the Super Bowl can start. So indeed, the approach really that we apply typically when we are asked to help with this is an approach in 4 steps, and that's what we would recommend. The first step is a controls diagnostic. The second step is a threat analysis, and I'll explain, but you cannot do a threat-based, a risk-based prioritization if you don't. And then, of course, a key element, especially in the context of NIS2, where the role of management is quite well highlighted in the regulation, is to have a management decision on controls that is risk-informed and traceable. And then, of course, you move into a monitoring and reporting on your compliance and efforts to move there. Now, let's look maybe first at the diagnostic. As Johan explained earlier, you've got a choice between industry frameworks and national guidelines. These feature a very extensive list of controls, which of course have a different focus depending. Now the question could be which one you choose, right? And on that, and that's our next slide, well, as you know, for the moment you can choose. Whether it will stay like that for every case, there are already cases where there is some consideration for a sort of mandatory control based on the national guidelines. In any case, using an industry framework has a series of advantages, which is that it's widely accepted and recognized, that if you want to go for a tool, it's embedded in most market tools, the NIS-TSF, the ISO 27001 controls you will find in there. It's not country specific. Some are even certifiable, and it can act as your universal control framework. On the other hand, if you go for the national guidelines at your basis, big advantage is that it's designed and promoted or promoted by national authorities and or your regulators. So you speak the same language, which can be beneficial. It may be closer to NIS2 specificities as well. At least you know that indeed the tone is right. But of course, it does vary between member states. This is why the last bullet of the first column can be important, a universal control framework that can be mapped to national guidelines. In more mature organizations, this is the direction that is being taken quite obviously. By the way, a question we get a lot then is Excel or tools. That's a very good question. Excel is of course the simple, flexible way to start, but the moment you have to start managing a wide variety of control frameworks, for example, some ad hoc tooling can become useful. I must say that with Microsoft Power Automate, there's also a lot you can do to make your process more efficient around maintaining compliance, but that will be probably a topic for another webinar. Now, of course, you've got vulnerabilities, right? And if you click Johan, the text will appear. The vulnerabilities, basically, that is insufficient control, which creates vulnerabilities. But if you want to have a risk-based approach, you need a threat vision as well. This is the degree of threat that will drive the degree of risk. Basically, a vulnerability that cannot be exploited will have a lesser degree of risk than a vulnerability which is being actively exploited. Think of everything that revolves around ransomware, and you know already that the probability of such attacks is very high, and therefore that the controls you need to implement around it probably are important. So vulnerability, threat together bring you the risk. That's the basic idea. And so now that you've done an assessment of all the different controls, what you're going to do is a bit of threat modeling. We do that in a pretty simple way. There's enough excellent reports out there that give you some very clear indications of what the threats are. Take the NIS2 threat landscape, the SENSE attack and threat report, which is really case-based, the data breach incident report for Verizon. What's interesting there is that not only do you have the top intrusion vectors, but you also have a number of stories and case studies, and that will be useful, and we'll see it afterwards when you have to communicate. So first question is, what are the most prominent threat scenarios today? And based on this, of course, you're going to build a series of threat scenarios that are specific to your organization. And that's the next slide. You assemble this. I'm not going to give you a threat modeling lesson now. This is an example of how you assemble the threat scenarios. How many threat scenarios do you want? Because, of course, you do have to have a limit. It really depends on how you manage this. For small organizations, typically we go for a top 5, which, of course, is an approach you could challenge. In other cases, you go for everything that rates very high or high. Here you have a score of 5, for example. Having a finite list is sometimes a practical objective. And then, of course, once you have this, the whole point is to link it to the controls, to map it to the controls. At that moment, you can really demonstrate how certain threats rely on certain controls more than others, and therefore prioritize your choices around controls, which I think is the whole point. And you make it in a way that is demonstrable, traceable, and that is quite easy to explain to your management, because, of course, that's a key element in this part as well. I say that because very often we are involved in assessments that are done for the first time. We have to go to management for the first time with a big chunk of cybersecurity topics, making the threats the basis for the story makes it just easier to tell. So vulnerability and threat gives you your areas of action. That's the idea of the second step. That's where you set your priorities. Then comes the third step, and that is, of course, the moment with the hammer. That's management decisions. Now, a word on this. Maybe we can move to the next slide, or maybe it's just... yes, something that must be said and that I often forget to mention. What comes out of the threat analysis really is the importance of the human factor. I think I don't have to explain anyone. And the humans are not only users, it's also your developers, also your system engineers, also the people at your suppliers. I think it goes without saying. The 5T is an interesting way to think about what you want to do around it. Teasers to foster awareness. You can use many ways to foster awareness. Training to understand cyber risks, and training in the case of NIS2 for us often starts with management, which we have to onboard into the whole program. Testing, teaming, replacing individual shame with collective success. I think I don't have to tell you that it works better than saying you're an idiot and you clicked on this. And then, of course, the threat from the inside. Don't get us wrong, we are well aware that the insider threat is today not the main source of cybersecurity incidents, but what is certain, of course, is that in any cyber attack, the user is involved, or in most cyber attacks, the user is involved at one point, either actively or passively in bad design choices. So the people part is not unimportant. I'm sure I'm preaching people that are convinced. And the 5T is an interesting way to check if your actions are complete, if your proposition there is complete. Now, back to the management decision, right? We just want to stress that a risk-based approach, it works for all organizations. If you are a less mature organization, how do we approach that in less mature organizations, right? We combine basically threat briefing and decision-making into one management workshop, which means that the first step is that we brief management on key threat scenarios. Of course, when you do ask for 2 hours to management, very often they're reluctant. When you say it's for big regulation with big fines and that they're accountable, they understand a bit better. And the moment you start with the briefing on the key threat scenarios, you have an opportunity to also, based on cases, based on expert reports, maybe based on testimonials. Sometimes we invite our colleagues from the CSIRT, for example, to tell stories from the trenches. Well, you can basically create a true momentum, but also a finer understanding of why we are doing certain things, why we are proposing certain priorities. So your whole threat story starts with really a bit of education, you could say. And then, of course, you can build on that to establish the link between the control categories and objectives you're proposing and the threats you've explained, and then present a plan which you can get validated. Of course, in that meeting, you also agree on the governance, which is going to ensure the management oversight of the resulting security program. So as you see, it's a risk-based approach. It's a workshop, a bit of preparation work indeed, but starting from the threat, you have a good story to justify your choices of control. Then, of course, there will be management decision involved and probably some cut in the budgets you had in mind. That's, I'm afraid, very often reality. The more mature organizations, on the other hand, there what we've been doing a lot is to help them with bringing, I would say, the decision-making level to a broader perspective. One element there, which is something many organizations talk about but haven't really implemented yet, is a formal risk appetite. Now, what is a risk appetite? It's a very complex thing to define, but in general, it is indeed the level of risk you are ready to accept. And this is obviously not something that you can do yourself in information security. It's business dynamics that will drive it. It's also the financial strength of the organization that will be a key driver, since at the end, it's really about what the company can tolerate or not in terms of its financial health and survival. The then second step, which is not a simple one either, is to evaluate the risk level against that appetite. Actually, what we notice is that our clients have enormous amounts of data points that can be consolidated. For example, with weighted sums of risks and vulnerabilities known per asset, with control effectiveness, which is being measured, and which can be assembled to give a series of indicators, a series of measures, and appreciation of your current risk level. And it's interesting because you can use that to drive decisions at a more micro level, for example, at an asset level, and you can use it to drive, of course, your decisions at a more macro level as well. So it means that once you have implemented these concepts, you can use them to steer your security program, but also manage what I would refer generically as a risk acceptance process. And so this is just to tell you that whether you're a less mature organization or more mature organizations, the risk-based approach is something which really has concrete implementations, and in both cases will help you to manage decisions. What's important is in here is that documentation is key. And I think that in a risk-based approach, especially in the context of conformity and compliance, making sure that indeed you have documented the whole process from meeting minutes to actually a traceable threat analysis is crucial. And it's the whole challenge, of course, of the balance between documentation and compliance, and we'll come back to that in a second. So we've basically completed the cycle now. We've done a controls diagnostic, which we prioritize based on threats. We assemble a roadmap, and management decision is quite crucial in here, where we make it threat-based, risk-based, giving them basically the tools to decide in a way where you can also demonstrate to whoever will come and verify what you've done, that this followed a rigorous and sound risk management process. From there, of course, it's about monitoring and reporting. That's a topic in itself. I just have one short slide on this. It's a dashboard that we use at our smaller customers in that case. This actually comes from the Siphon framework, the Excel that many of you have probably seen if you're in Belgium. We just add here a number. The nice way the number is that you see the evolution. If you went from 39 to 42, it's a good sign. Of course, the challenge you have then is to explain that the threat landscape is evolving and that 42 today is not 42 in 5 years. With highlights, lowlights, and decision requested, you can have dashboards that enable you to report your management on a regular basis. Obviously, this is a very simplified explanation. So what are then the practical steps to take, right? I think that today, the first thing to do is to define your method in a way which is documented, of course. So understand your top threats and pick a control framework. And based on that, and it will take you at least a month, depending on the size of your organization, it may take more. You might also want to take some shortcuts sometimes. You will evaluate the controls. You will propose a plan that you will, of course, in a management workshop, review and decide upon, so that you have a cybersecurity program. Small thing, we don't like to call them NIS2 program. The NIS2 program gives the feeling that once the program is done, everything is secure and it's done, because NIS2 is implemented, right? So let's talk about something else now. I think the reality is that the threat landscape evolves, and if you look even at the whole logic of NIS2, it's a continuous process. So NIS2 program can sometimes be a counterproductive name, but maybe that's an opinion here. And then, of course, you want to get the basics going. I think that here, if we have two things to highlight, it's, as Johan said, also the two topics that received a new degree of attention with the NIS2 directive. It's incident handling on the one hand, it's a business continuity on the other hand. Dealing with this also in ransomware times is not so simple. And we'll probably do a webinar. We have a webinar on NIS2 and incident handling a bit later, and we'll probably do something on the ransomware readiness of your backups and ERP and BCP very soon as well, so stay tuned. And then, of course, from there you implement, monitor, you track the maturity increase. I think one important word to complete here the story is the documentation. Documentation is crucial. It's not something anyone likes to do, but the whole point is to find the balance between maximum compliance with minimum documentation. That's our motto when we do CISO as a service work. And I think it's something worth thinking of. We're talking about policies, for example. Policies are crucial, but do you need to document every policy, every decision that you've made around cybersecurity? Or do you have to have principles are documented when you need them, and for the rest, robust process to make decisions with the key highlights being documented in, for example, a tracking system. That's the sort of things we should try to do. Sometimes a good ticket is better than a wrong policy when it's a problem that you're not going to solve every month. And I think it's one very simple example of how you want to avoid over documentation. This being said, one area where you can certainly use some quality, nice looking documentation is everything you send to your customers. And I'm sure that many of you know this as well. This is where a bit of a marketing touch is always welcome. Let me see, I think there's one last slide with a small message to tell you that you can get, as a small business, if you're a small business, subsidies and financial support from the different regions. The Flemish framework in that sense is quite remarkable, as I'm sure you know. It provides a subsidy up to 45%, 55% of the costs. So it's very substantial indeed. But even in Brussels, you can get 40 to 60% covered as well, depending a bit on your situation. Of course, this is for small businesses, but it's certainly interesting to know, and sometimes to tell your smaller suppliers as well, if you are yourself a bigger organization. I would simply end then by saying that, as we said, it's the first of a series of webinars on NIS2. The next ones are coming up. Please mark them in your agenda, of course. And there will be more. Our idea is to have always as a topic NIS2 and one very concrete security problem to solve. And so we expect to roll more of them out over the year. And with this, Jeroen, I think we can.
Yeah, perfect. Thank
questions.
you. Thank you very much for this presentation. So thank you, Vincent, Johan. I'm monitoring the chat and the Q&A session at the moment. So we have one question from Frederick. Let me quickly bring it up on the screen. So yeah, one of the questions that was raised was one of the slides mentioned an essential entity is an organization with at least 20 million euros in revenue and at least 100 employees. Is this really correct? Because yeah, there's some additional details there in the question as well. The understanding is that essential entities and large companies that are part of the sector of high criticality are listed in Annex 1 of the NIS2, and also a large entity is defined with at least 250 employees or with an annual turnover of at least 50 million euros or a balance sheet of at least 43 million euros. And it's a similar remark for important entities. So I don't know if you have any additional insights on that one related to the essential entity and the important entities.
We'll have to check if we made a mistake, but...
Yeah, and also, I mean, the text of the regulation will be guiding, right? So if what was mentioned on the slide is not the exact numbers, we will have to replace them by the numbers of the regulation. But think of it in the following way. If you are a reasonably sizable company, let's say 150 employees, your balance sheet, you know, it may fluctuate, it may be over or below 43 million. Your turnover may be over or below the threshold, but you will sort of get in scope, and therefore you need to worry about this topic. So the precise, let's say, definition of who is in and who is out are in the regulation, but companies are dynamic, right? They buy other companies, they sell activities, so they may drift in and out. And I think the implication will be driven by the very large companies that questions will be asked to these type of companies because they often are suppliers to very big companies who by definition are definitely in scope. So the need for a documented control framework is quote unquote something good to have. The precise borderline indeed may be somewhat, let's say, detailed. But at the end of the day, if you manage a growing mid-sized company, the probability that you will meet NIS2 either directly or indirectly is very, very high.
Okay, thank you for that. I hope that answered the question a little bit, but indeed it can, yeah, we will check that as well. We have another question coming in. Let me make it a little bit larger.
And that one is tough. Yeah.
Can you clarify which national legislation will be applicable for international companies, country of HQ, country of the site, both? What takes precedence if there is a conflict in understanding the requirements? So, yeah.
Yeah, I give this quite a lot of thought because it is an intriguing question. So let's assume, and it's good always to take a use case, right? So let's assume that you are operating in 5 European countries. Let's say that you sell, I don't know, over the internet sporting shoes, and all of a sudden, and you have a data center in another country, let's say Ireland, and all of a sudden you have an incident. And I think here we will have to learn a bit how to do it. But to me, the guidance I would offer to handle this would be the following. You know, where is the impact? So let's imagine that you have a case of DDoS, and let's say your data center is in Ireland, but your German customers are affected. Then I would say probably you need to notify the German authorities because it is in Germany that the impact will be felt. In other cases, it could be that, you know, you need to inform in multiple countries. Or, you know, if you are in a shared data center, which is co-located with other clients, maybe the Irish authorities need notification as well. So the guiding line for me would be, if you are doing business in a jurisdiction and there is impact through a cyber incident and you know it, then I would follow that jurisdiction. Is that multiple countries? Then probably you will have to notify multiple times. Of course, if you have one infrastructure serving, let's say, 20 European markets, it's probably the same notification. I do think that we will have to develop a little bit of experience and wisdom because, of course, you're going to get some false positives. And to me, it's a little bit unclear how that will play out because the workload for the national cyber authorities could be quite significant as well. So I think this will be a little bit of a learning curve, but I would follow the instinct in terms of where is the impact. And that I think will bring you pretty far in complying the right way.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, I think for digital service providers, they can have a one-stop shop approach. There is, I must say, we rarely have the heavy discussions on the scoping because typically that's done before we arrive and with lawyers. But if I'm not mistaken, digital service providers can have can choose a one-stop shop, or at least responding to certain conditions. Now, independently from all of this, the one-stop shop issue is a very challenging one, and there's very divided opinions within the Commission and even the Parliament, because indeed what everybody wants to avoid is some sort of regulatory dumping, where you would choose basically the most favorable country to establish your main entity. Think of Ireland with Facebook and Microsoft, of course. While in the meantime, everybody understands that the complexity and the uncertainty is making it very hard to manage for organizations that operate across Europe. So it will be very interesting to see also how it evolves. But my personal feeling is that it was a choice not to choose somehow in the text that was published.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that answer. I'm just looking, so we got some additional feedback or additional insights on the scoping of the essential.
Yeah, so we did make a mistake, and of course you know what it is, right? You check every slide except the thing which is obvious, and then that's where you have mistakes.
Okay, yeah. I don't see any questions at the moment anymore, so I think we can wrap up from that perspective. So again, I want to thank you all for joining, as Vincent and Johan already mentioned. So within Enviso, we are really trying to share our expertise, trying to share our insights with these kind of webinars. So there will be indeed a NIS2 webinar series. So keep monitor our social media channels, and you will also receive a follow-up email with a link towards the recording, and also with a small feedback form, because we really appreciate your feedback there, to see which topics we need to cover or which topics are of interest to you. So that we can improve also from that perspective our webinars. It doesn't need to be only related to topics, it can also be like general feedback. So from that perspective, it would be great if we can have some feedback via that feedback form. And I think with that, I still want to thank Johan and Vincent for this very interesting presentation. So the first of the three. And I'm looking forward to the next one. And I hope you will all join for the next one. So I would say a good rest of the day, and I will hope to see you soon. So thank you all for joining, and talk to you soon.